Someone sent me this raw piano clip. So I studied Rachmaninoff and orchestrated it as if the great Russian had done it himself. So I'm going to show you how we can study a score, sketch out musical ideas, and then orchestrate so we can sound like Rachmaninoff, or whoever you want to sound like. Because really, these are principles you can use for any piece of music. Let's go. The piano clip that Donald sent me is very heavy in every respect. It's got all the bass, all the harmony, and all the melody, because it was originally intended as a solo piano piece. When I heard that and he wanted it cinematized and sounding like an orchestra, I thought, I gotta write orchestration around the piano, but the piano is still covering melody and bass and harmony, and it's doing everything and all these crazy arpeggios. So I thought, how am I supposed to create orchestration that enhances the piano while allowing the piano to still lead? And I thought, how does Rachmaninoff do it? How did Rachmaninoff create orchestrations that allow the piano to lead and still create these wonderful sounds and wonderful climaxes? This is the climax of his second piano concerto. And you can see that the melody is in yellow here, and it's carried by the flutes in octaves, and by the oboes in octaves, and then by the strings, that's violins, second violins, viola, and cello, across 3 different octaves. This famous... So the piano is taking a lot of texture and a lot of rhythm. I'm not going to try and play it. But because the piano is taking so much activity and rhythm, the strings and the upper woodwinds can really take this melody easily and let it soar all in unison. And meanwhile, the harmony is taken entirely by clarinets, bassoons, 4 horns at various intervals. We get the trombones and the tuba and the timpani marking these cadences, right? So, you know, it's ya dee 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 doo doo, and on the bum bum, that kind of thing. And if we look here, it carries on being that way throughout. The melody is carried in unison, and the harmony is carried in unison. And there's basically no moment. I marked in this timpani line, because the timpani is actually used very sparingly in this climax, so I marked it there in blue. But otherwise, it's actually incredibly simple, which makes for an amazing climax. What about the climax of Rachmaninoff's third piano concerto, eh? The last minute or so of Rachmaninoff's third piano concerto is incredibly emotive. But you look at the piano, it's going bum bum ba dum ba bum 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 beep beep. And it is playing a melody this time rather than just playing rhythm. But what are the strings doing? All playing in unison. Well, sorry, in octaves. They're all playing the same melody in octaves. And in this case, the harmony is carried once again by the 4 horns and the woodwind, and the flute is added. But it's just this amazing melody which he really lets everyone play. It starts around here, this ya dee 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 dee. Page turn. Dee 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 dee. And then at this great moment, the trombones and tuba enter as well. There is a little bit of counterpoint here, a little bit of chromatic counterpoint, but it's all harmony until this great trumpet line. In fact, I'll play you just 5 seconds so I hopefully don't get copyright struck. So there is that extra trumpet line melody, but otherwise it's pretty straightforward, honestly. This melody is carried across the 4 strings, and the harmony is carried across the winds and the lower brass, and then there is that little counter melody in trumpets. He really saves the trumpet and the timpani for special moments. Now, how does he begin the concertos? I'm talking orchestrally. I'm trying to figure out how to accompany a piano part in the style of Rachmaninoff. So again, the melody here is violin, violin 2, and viola, all in unison, and the clarinet is also in unison here. And they're just going... right? And meanwhile, in pizzicato, the bass and cellos are going... And then the bassoons and the clarinet take a little bit of harmony too, and the horns add some harmony right at the end there. But generally, It's very straightforward as a beginning, isn't it? What about the third concerto? It's actually surprisingly similar beginning. The clarinets and bassoons have 2 bars of just going. We have the cellos, basses, and timpani going. The violas and violins are going sort of, bum bum bum, doodle doodle doodle, doodle doodle doodle. They're just outlining the chord patterns, adding a bit of rhythmic energy and interest there. And again, there's harmony in the bassoon, horns, and clarinets. Have we seen that before? Yes, because it works. This is the thing. His accompaniments can be dead simple because the piano is carrying the bulk of the weight. Earlier, all the violins were in big octave melody because the piano had a lot of texture to cover that. In this case, what we're really learning to do here is write around the piano. How do you create a texture which supports the piano, creates an interesting climax for the piano or an interesting beginning for the piano, but doesn't get in the way of the piano? So that's the thing with it. The textures are very delicate and they're just supporting the main melody. And it's the same with the second piano concerto as well. The textures are very simple because the piano is already doing all the arpeggiations, all the harmony, all the this and that. What I also did here is I took notes, and these aren't very readable notes. I don't think this would make a very good resource, but it was just for me to get it inside my head that at these climaxes, he uses certain instrumentals. 4 bars of the final approach, the melody adds these instruments, and he adds these instruments and timpani roll, violins, 1, 2, viola in octaves high, and clarinets are in octaves too. All these different orchestrations, movement 3 climax is different as well. It was just to internalize this before I started working on this piece of music. So I took notes too. So now I want you to watch the raw piano clip and imagine how it might sound with orchestration by Rachmaninoff. The place where I started first was actually the climax. If you listen here, I already knew that his piano part would have a similar melody in the violins, but the piano would be more elaborate and the main melody would just outline it in the violins, like this. You see what I mean? So we got this ya ba ya da dee dee. It's not got that ya ba 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 ba. That's a sort of Rachmaninovian addition to everything, okay? And then from there, I wanted some kind of counter melody. The bass and the harmony is already taken care of on the piano, but I wanted some kind of counter melody. So I had. And then from there, what I did is add this harmony. Because what I noticed as well in Rachmaninoff is when the horns are taking the harmony, they tend to move, rather than just being chord, 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 chord. I noticed that the inner voices move every half bar. And the inner voices would move ba dee dee dee, chord, chord. So I tried to imitate that here with the inner voices and the harmony. Now, I know that will sound really weird to you, and that's because I've made a tempo map so I can follow Donald's rubato as closely as possible. And that means that when you listen to those lines independently, they sound very weird and out of time, but in context, it works. And then I went back to the beginning. And in the beginning, the first thing that I heard was this imitation, right? I heard an imitation, I tried it a few different ways, and in reality you often have to chip away at it and sort of figure out how the imitation will work best. Because this third one, originally I tried on quite a different tone of the scale, and eventually decided it worked better where it is now. Beyond that, I wanted to try something a bit like the beginning of Rachmaninoff 2. You remember those violins going dee dee dee? And so we wrote something like this. So that's what we got. And finally, the bass, just like Rachmaninoff 2 and 3, is going. Now, these were my sketches. This is how I sketched out before I orchestrated. The reality is it changed quite dramatically from sketches to final product. In some ways, in other ways not so much. So let's hear what happened. First we had violins, violas, cellos, and flutes playing that climax, and oboes too. Then I tried this counter melody in the trumpets. And then the timpani is used on particular accents, just to accent particular emphasis. And then I filled the rest of the brass in with appropriate harmony, and the rest of the woodwinds with appropriate harmony. So the orchestra on its own will sound a bit like this. Now, for this imitation at the beginning, I knew already that I wanted it to be in winds. So it's just flutes and oboes in winds right now, if you listen to it. And then we've got that plucking, a bit like the beginning of Rachmaninoff 2 or 3, that plucking in cellos and basses, pizzicato, and a bit of timpani too. And then the violins and viola. And I changed the notes here a bit to make it fit a little better in context. So look, the reality is, I think in the absolute climax, Rachmaninoff would have written the piano to be bum 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 boom 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 bum. That would have made it sound even more climactic. Of course, Donald wrote this as a solo piece, so he had to fit everything in one. But I was thinking, how would it be even more climactic? And I think having the piano really take up the full range of that climax and allowing the orchestra to sing the melody would be an amazing thing. I did a few mixing tricks on this piano to try and make it blend more with the orchestra. But the reality is this was filmed on a phone, and trying to make it blend with good orchestral samples was a challenging job. But that said, the point of this was to show you how you can take a score, model it, learn from it, and then compose quickly in the style of that composer. So here is Donald Sosin's Mare Nostrum cinematized. Now I know it wasn't perfect, but that said, it's wonderful to be able to dive into a score, learn from it, and then try applying those techniques yourself. I only had a few hours to do this, but it taught me so much about writing around the piano, creating a wonderful orchestral climax while allowing the piano to really sing and take its own center stage. So hopefully you can go away, find some scores of music you love, and you can do the same at home too.